is this machine learning? What are we trying to do here? So this is a very simple diagram that places machine learning within the greater field of artificial intelligence. So consider a subgroup of artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence, AI, you can consider it as this set of technologies that try to produce human-like outputs. So where we have certain predictions, motions, understanding, recognition of certain patterns. And machine learning pretty much provides the algorithms to achieve those tasks. So you can think of machine learning or ML as the series of operations that figure out in a way how to predict an input, how to predict an output from an original input. So more technically, it's the ability of learning from a series of input data and make prediction on new unseen data. And so pretty much this is a simple visualization of what it ultimately entails. So trying to learn from an input data that in this case is represented by a combination of two images, a 0 and a 1, trying to fit it to a certain algorithm that makes a certain number of decisions about this input data and then trying to predict a corresponding output. So in this case, we have a simple representation. You can see from afar that these are 0s and 1s, but you might expect a lot of noise, a lot of redundancy of these type of data and a lot of variety, and makes it more complicated for an algorithm to more accurately produce results that are actually what we would expect. So with a variety of input data feeding into an algorithm, we get a prediction with a certain amount of accuracy. So this is the general general philosophy of how these sort of models work. And as you might expect, there's a lot of variety, a lot of complexity within these models. But in a way, they all have similar characteristics. So despite the variety, the core principle is that they all revolve around data. So trying to learn and improve from an input data, and especially when it comes to large data, the ultimate predictions are likely to be of a better quality. And so trying to identify these patterns and relationships within the data that it was originally fed in. So this is primarily resolved via a set of rules and decisions that are typical to specific algorithms. And so these rules and predictions and decisions try to guide the ultimate prediction of what we're working with. So there are many of these systems. So we're going to touch on some of these eventually later on in the presentation and within the tutorial. But primarily, we have identified three main types of learning models. The first one that you are all very familiar, the first two that you're all very familiar with are supervised learning models and unsupervised learning models. So the idea of a supervised learning model is that we have the luxury of having input data that we know what it look like. So we know we have an input data that corresponds to a 0 and a 1. This is the idea of labeled data. We feed this data to an algorithm that will try to predict what the ultimate output would be. And then the ultimate output, we can corroborate it with some ground truth, with some validation data. So this is the idea of supervised learning, because in a way you supervise the process by giving information about the data and what the ultimate truth would be. The idea of unsupervised learning is that it's slightly different, because you would expect the initial data to have no luxury of having labels. So you don't know exactly what are the patterns, what are the structures that you're looking within this data, which is very likely also to be noisy, to have a lot of redundancy in it. And so it's more of an exploratory process and trying to find these patterns and relationships through a set of decisions. So the main difference between these two aspects is that with the supervised learning, we have labeled data. We know exactly what these input data are, and we can make predictions and infer from it. With unsupervised learning, we don't know exactly what is going on with the data, and we need to figure out the structures and patterns within it. There's a third learning model that we're not really going to touch on in this presentation, but this is the idea of reinforcement learning. So the idea of learning by doing. Trials and errors. If you do well, then you get a good reward. If you don't do well, then you lose points. This is more of an argument for more of a topic for our third workshop. So for now, we'll primarily focus on supervised and unsupervised learning models. And we'll start with the supervised now.
There are many supervised learning models. If we draw an axis and rate them from the most simple ones to the most complex ones, and on the very left, we have some rule-based or statistical models that we probably learned in the stats class. For example, division trees, which we will introduce in this workshop, and linear logistic regressions. And at the very end of complex, there are neural networks. And when the computation layers in the neural network is so complex and there are so many layers, it's deep learning. And we will talk about this on March 24th in workshop 3. So come to the workshop if you're interested in this. And in the middle, there is ensemble, which is like a combination of the simpler models. So one simplest tree-based model is decision trees. So this mimics the decision process in real life. For example, some bank manager may have to make a decision of if she needs to grant a loan to someone, and she might look at the age first. If the age is larger than 40, maybe she thought this person doesn't need a loan. And and later she might look at real estate status and see if the loan applicant having this. And by making a lot of decisions, she comes to the hard decision of accept the loan application or decline. So this is not a machine learning model yet. It's just a process, model decision process. And so let me use an example to illustrate how the machine learning decision tree works. So suppose we have an axis and there are different numbers showing the positions of these balls. And some are oranges, some are orange, some are blue. And our goal is to predict the color of the balls based on its position. So if we can only make one decision, we can choose when this value is less than 12. And if it's less than 12, we classify them into one group. And if it's larger than 12, we classify them in another group. So from this simple decision, we can see the classification isn't very successful, but it is the most successful among all the other potential options. So rather than selecting 12 as the decision threshold, we can actually have many other options. We can choose number 4 or number 18. So how do we decide which choice is the best? And a common criterion to evaluate this is information entropy. It is inspired by the entropy definition from physics. So in physics, when particles are aligned, the system has low entropy. And when the particles are all over the places, which is very messy, the system has high entropy. And we can calculate the entropy using this formula, which is the negative sum of the probability times probability of balls being classified correct times the log to p probability. And we, in the machine learning process, we iterate through many choices and select the choice that leads to the least information entropy. So by doing these decisions 20 times, we can construct a whole decision tree that predicts the ball color based on its position. So this model uses sequential splits to predict the color outcomes. And each node, these are nodes, at each node, it asks a yes/no question to partition the data. So this model is easy to interpret. It's intuitive because it mimics human decision.
Yeah.
Oh, this is okay. However, this model might not be applied very well if we like add a ball, orange ball right here, right? So this is called overfitting, because if we added any balls in the initial data set, the model will not perform well. So a decision tree can become too detailed, memorizing the noise in the training data. And this issue leads to poor performance on new unseen data. And there are some techniques to help simplify the tree and improve the generalization issue. A method is called bagging. Bagging actually has nothing to do with the bag. It's short from bootstrap aggregating. I'll use a bag that has balls inside. They have different numbers and different colors. I'll use this as an example to illustrate bagging. So suppose our region data set has balls which has number 1 to 10. And we can take a ball from the bag and write down its number. And we suppose it's number 6. We put it back and draw another one and write it down. It's number 7 and put it back on number 3. And we draw another one. It's number 6 again. So by repeating this process, we have a subset that have that potentially have repetitive data from the original data set. And it's called a bootstrap sample. So using this bootstrap sample, we can train a decision tree model, which is probably overfitting, just like illustrated. However, we can aggregate all the decision trees trained based on the subsets and get a ensemble model. So for classification, the ensemble model takes a majority vote from each decision tree, and this reduces the impact from outliers. Another method that derived from bagging is random forest. Random forest model is basically bagging times variable subspace. So remember, we have these bootstrap samples. However, when we train the data, train the model, we don't use all the features. So suppose we have a tabular data set, we have many rows of observations and have variable 1, variable 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And to train each decision tree model based on the bootstrap sample, we randomly select a subspace of the subspace of the variables. So for random forest model, also the classification takes a majority vote and reduces impact from outliers. Also, it reduces the correlation among the individual trees. These plots show how a decision tree, a bag ensemble of trees, and the random forest classify into class data sets. So in this example, we have different circles. They're synthetic data. They have 2 colors, and they have an x-axis and a y-axis value. And in the decision tree model, we can see the horizontal lines or vertical lines, and each line represents a decision rule from the nodes. And we can see these in the decision tree model, the classification is pretty overfitted. The shape looks very strange. And ensemble methods often produce a smoother, more accurate decision values. And we have this the code to generate the synthesized data and to run the 3 model in the Jupyter notebook, and we can distribute the slides and link to run. And another method to solve overfitting is cross-validation, k-fold cross-validation. So in cross-validation, it means you have the original data set and you chop it into pieces, and the number of pieces they become is k. And for example, if we split our original data set into 5 parts, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let's look at the first round first. And we use 4 chunks of the data to do the model training and use 1 chunk of the data to do model validation. And we, so using this data set, we can train a model. And we have, and in the second experiment, we use another chunk of the data to do validation and other 4 to do training. And we can repeat these methods. So the model, overall, the model is trained on k-1 folds and tested on the 1 fold. And this process repeats k time, which with each fold serving as a test set once. And the accuracy and errors from the k models are then averaged for a more reliable estimate. Beside bagging, there is an algorithm called boosting. So again, let's start from the original data set that has blue circles and red circle. And in the first step, we take a split and split it into 2 parts and try to group the circles that have the same colors together. And you can see, oh, there are on the right, there are 2 full blue circles. It's great, but on the left, we have both blue and red circles. It's supposed to be all red. So we can upsample the wrongly classified observations and go to the next step. Then in the next step, we split again and found it correctly classified 2 circles on the left, but on the right, it has some red circles that are wrongly classified. So we upsample the red observations and go to the next step. So after we having 3 classifiers or more than 3 classifiers, we can combine the classification rules together with some weights. The rules to determine the weights differ in different boosting libraries or packages, but the overall rule is the more correct the single model is, the higher the weight it has. Yeah. So this boosting algorithm became very popular because of Kaggle competition. So if you don't know what it is, it's a competition that people or organizations post machine learning questions here, and everyone is free to participate to solve the problem with machine learning models. And there are some awards related to the best models. Sometimes the award is $30,000, which is 1 PhD year here, or it can be $2 million. A lot of PhDs. And so during some time, there is a library called XGBoost. It quickly gained a lot of attention because it's performed so well, and it was on the top of the models that performed. And it's published by this person, PNC Chen, and his GitHub is here. So XGBoost is not a novel method, but rather an extremely efficient implementation of classical gradient boosting machines.
Okay, well then, so this pretty much concludes the supervised talk. We've seen tree-based decisions, random forest, bagging and boosting, overfitting. Here, the scenario is a little bit different. Here, we don't have the luxury of labeled data. So we don't really know exactly what we're dealing with. So this is pretty much what Jing just showed. So we have data that we know exactly where they belong. We have 3 different groups. But for a moment, imagine that this were all gray, like you couldn't really determine the colors. So how many groups do you see here? Do you see 3 distinct groups, and then you see some noise within data? Or are you primarily looking at, again, three different groups, but we include a different sample within those? And then again, you can have different aggregations of this data. For example, you only see a couple of these. So as you may see, having everything, imagine being great, you don't have knowledge a priori of what exactly is going on within this data. And so you can really identify where the data belongs. And so this is probably one of the biggest problems with unsupervised learning. That is more an exploratory mission that you're taking up, where you need to figure out where these patterns are and what are the relationships that govern how the data gets redistributed. So if I'm looking at predicting what colors these are going to be, how many of these groupings am I going to have, how are these structured? And so as you may imagine in here as well, we're going to have a variety of algorithms that have been developed to do these partitioning. So this is just a small sample of what you could find out there in the literature. We have a variety of these. Some of the very popular ones are k-means, agglomerative clustering, and DDH scan, or its hierarchical form, HDDH scan. You see that these algorithms are developed to answer specific questions. So they are suited for a specific objective, a specific type of data. If we look, for example, at the first row of this large diagram, we have that k-means according to its internals. So it's not really doing a great job, from my perspective at least, at identifying these two shapes, these two circles. But for example, if we are looking at a different algorithm, if we're asking a different type of question, where we really want to separate these two circles, well, maybe other algorithms are better designed to solve these issues. For other tasks, for example, when we look at separating clusters separating groupings or clusters in other fashions, maybe k-means really performs better than other algorithms. But again, it kind of raises the question: how many of these things do we have? How many groupings are we gonna see in this data? How do we define them? So we'll see some of these examples later on. This is again a bit of the problem of the subjectivity of the algorithms. So one example that I think is very important to understanding unsupervised learning is the idea of a spatial context, dimensionality, and distances. So if we take this simple map of observations, they have spatial information associated with them. They have a north thing and an east thing. So again, how many clusters do you see here? How many groupings? So is there like a big one going on over here? There's something along the streets, maybe something else over there. To answer this question properly, we need to know the internals of the algorithms. How are they behaving? How are they getting these information? So one simple example to get your head around this is through something called agglomerative clustering that we just saw. The idea of agglomerative clustering is I start by treating every single observation as a group per se, and then I start merging them one after the other based on a certain number of rules. And then you start building something that's called a linkage tree. So it tells you how certain observations are linked to other observations through a parameter that it's the distance. How far are these observations one from the other? These distances are very important concepts in unsupervised learning or clustering algorithms in general, because the type of distance that you pick is also what is going to dictate the final output for a specific algorithm. So if we use the same algorithm, but given a different criteria to separate my groups, then I would end up with very different clusters, very different groupings. This also raises another important point, and that's the idea of how many features does a single observation have. So in this case, this could be relatively simple to understand, where every single point has an X and Y coordinate. I only know where they are located. But say that now for every single point, pretend that it's a tree, I measure how tall it is, how wide the canopy is, how old it is, and so forth. And every single observation would end up with a large number of features associated with it. And mathematically, this becomes a bit of an issue, because the more of these dimensions, the more of these features you have, the more complex your computation becomes, and the more meaningful or less meaningful some distances become. So say that for one point, I have 100 characteristics associated with it. And then I need to measure how distant that point is to another point. Well, this is simple if you have only 2, but if you have 100, what are you going to measure? You're going to measure, and for example, Euclid's distance based on 100 points, mathematically, this is a problem because your hyperspace, the number of features that you have for an observation becomes very, very big, expands a lot. And so some of these metrics become less sensitive in measuring these enlarged hyperspace. And so the importance of picking the adequate criteria to measure distances is key when you want to separate these features. So again, say I'm interested in knowing only these two characteristics, X and Y, and I want to separate these trees. I'm going to cut these down, I'm going to keep these. And the way that I decide is through this linkage tree. So I know that this is different from this because I picked that the distance is around 0.75. This is a normalized distance. And then this could be, for example, how many meters these are far from each other. But again, someone else could come in and say, no, actually, I think that we have 6 of these going on in there. And someone else again can come and say, well, in the end, we have much, much more of these. So again, where is your boundary? How many of these features are you going to pick? This is a very important question when you do this type of analysis, because you start with something that is a bit unknown, a bit of noise. You don't have relationships to begin with. You kind of want to figure them out as you go. And again, this is the subjectivity of it. So again, this raises the question, how many of these clusters do I have? What is the right number? How can I find this exact number so that I'm good and I can publish my paper and no one raises the point? The idea is, imagine we have this blobs, a variety of features. So again, you can group them in different ways, but you have more solid approaches to define how many of these clusters you should have. So one common example, or two other common examples that are popular are silhouette scores and the elbow method. The elbow method, similar to the silhouette analysis, pretty much tells you, it tries to optimize a certain loss function. So the idea will be, I want to find the number of clusters that would give me the best result for example, I have the lowest sum of squares within clusters. How many of these am I going to have? Am I going to have 2 of these, or am I going to have, for example, 6 of this? So the silhouette coefficient values, silhouette scores, they give you a normalized value between -1 and 1, and that it's a pretty good metric that tells you how good your clustering, your unsupervised model did. Values of score around -1, meaning that these clusters, these points are fairly poorly assigned to these clusters. So probably that wasn't the right number of clusters to pick. Values around 0, meaning that we don't really know where these are, so they can stay there, but again, it's not ideal. The closer you have these values to 1, the better they are placed within the actual clusters. So again, we have in these examples only 2 clusters with an average of 0.7 versus we have 6 clusters with an average value around 0.5. So ultimately, you would tell me, okay, I have 2 clusters because I have a silhouette score that's much higher than if I had 6 clusters. The thing is, how this is it actually true that 2 clusters is the best way to go about it? Maybe there's something in the data that I know of, or that I see that it's not right, and tells me I actually have more than 2 clusters. So this idea of picking the right number, it's not a silver bullet. There's no single method that tells you exactly what the number of clusters you would have. It's a bit more subjective, and it's pretty much based, again, on the data that you have and the question that you're trying to answer. The elbow method, I don't have a representation here, but it's pretty similar. It looks pretty much like an elbow where I plot how many clusters I have versus what is the score that I'm looking at. So pretty much works like a silhouette score where I want to minimize, where I want to optimize a certain loss function. Again, I want to find the number of clusters that give me the lowest within cluster sum squares. The elbow method will tell you, okay, I find the 2 cluster again is the best value for the job. But it's again important to contextualize it to the data and to your objective. Benchmarks, we all love benchmarks. We want to know how fast things can go. If I have a lot of things going on and I have a lot of data that I need to perform, that I need to do analysis on, how much am I going to take? How long does it take? How long it is until my supervisor comes back to me and say, I want results now. So this is an example where we have k-means that are very, very fast algorithms. The approaches that the algorithms takes, the internals are very fast, so they can be applied to a large number of data and then can be easily scalable to, for example, clusters that we're going to see later on. Other algorithms are much more tailored to a smaller number of observations and really don't scale well with the number of data. So there's high space and time complexity for the algorithm. But again, this is pretty much for your knowledge. It's not really important at this point, but make sure that certain algorithms will perform differently depending on the data and the way that they are structured. So again, try to pick the best tool for the job. That's the key message. One other important thing that is part of unsupervised learning is dimensionality reduction. So I mentioned earlier that you could remember the map that we saw earlier. Every point could have 100 observations. And or we have a multi-band raster where one pixel represents 10 years of data for a specific scene. So this thing then becomes very difficult to visualize or try to understand relationships when the number of features for your observations are very high. So when you have a very highly dimensional space. This is the idea of the curse of dimensionality. I have this massive amount of data that keeps coming in, satellite data, drone data, people that collect data in the field and so forth. I need to find a way to minimize the noise and try to find actual key features that characterize my data set. So one way to do this is through dimensionality reduction. I have, in this case, 6 features, and through approaches like a principal component analysis, which is extremely common approach for dimensionality reduction, it comes back and it tells me I only have 3 of these features that are very important. They're important for you, and you don't really need B, C, F, and G. So we move from a higher dimensional space to a lower dimensional data, but you still maintain the key properties of that data set. So you maintain the key structure of the data set, even though you alter some of its features. So this is very important to consider, especially if you work with say local machines that can't really handle a lot of data, and you need to extract only core information. PCA or similar technologies are extremely important in this respect. Also for determining finding multidimensional noise. If you have a very complex data set, reducing its dimension, being able to plot those results might help you find the potential noise in the data after removing, after simplifying it and being able to visualize it. This is one example with the very famous iris dataset. We have 5 columns. We have a species, the iris, the flower, then the sepal length width, and the petal length width. We have 4 dimensions. We can imagine what a 4th dimension would look like. We can plot it. We could potentially separate these outputs into 4 separate graphs, but imagine you're working again with 100 of these features. How are you going to find these relationships? How are you going to be able to see what the key attributes of these data sets are? So again, through dimensionality reduction, you can squeeze this dimension into a meaningful number that you can plot and more easily say, okay, this is where my data is. This is what my data looks like. I don't see a greater deal of noise here, but it's a much better visualization tool. It's a much better way to get to know your data and then further applying techniques to extrapolate patterns and relationships. Again, importance of dimensionality reduction because we are in the era of the big data. There's lots of data coming in. There's increased information need. Foresters want to know where they have to plant, what trees they have to cut, how much of it. So there's this large and especially very fast input of data, especially in fields like remote sensing. We have satellites orbiting and we acquire information on a regular basis. And we have to have tools and algorithms that are capable to deal with these scenarios. So how can we go ahead and do this? Well, we have Digital Research Alliance of Canada that came to help. This is a high performance computing clusters that are distributed across Canada from Vancouver to Halifax. We are lucky that as SFU, we have a close one called CEDAR, that the ability of accessing clusters within one project for the lower part of the country, it's an awesome achievement, even for cross-boundary science, where now me from Vancouver can access the server that they have, I don't know, in Quebec or in Ontario and do my computation on their end. Because we got to face it, the hard truth is that my computer only has 1 CPU and 1 GPU. The HPC that Canada Alliance has boasts 230,000 CPUs and almost 24,000 GPUs. So there's a lot of meat that you can feed on it. The idea is that through Digital Research Alliance, we can establish these clusters that are across the country with the objective of advancing the positions of Canada as a leader in the knowledge economy, international state. These are very big words, but we're going to see a little bit what this can, how can this help us promote our research and do our research more at scale if there's the need of. The HPC works relatively, the concept is very simple. We'll see more of this in a later workshop. But you start by getting an access. This is a very regulated system. So you need your login node where you can log in through an SSH tunnel, for example. Within this login node, you have access to a certain amount of storage where you can put your data and you can collect your data. And through only this login node, you can communicate with the cluster. Cluster is composed of a series of computers that are scheduled together by a single unity. We'll see a bit more of this later on. And then based on the number of resources that you needed, then your work will be dispatched to the proper nodes, where again, a node represents a single computer with a certain number of CPUs, a certain number of cores per CPU. And so you can specify exactly how many resources and what resources you need. You get placed into a queue because everyone really wants to access these type of resources. And then when your turn comes, then you can access these resources and run your computation on it. These computer nodes are Linux-based systems, so you need to have a bit of familiarity with it on how they operate. But the three things that you need to, it's not very complicated because we'll see later on some tools that can make this much easier to implement. So the idea though is like you need three simple things. So you need to have code that is pretty much efficient. So then the moment that you get a place in the queue, your code runs and runs successfully. You need to be able to submit these jobs and then gather these results from the computer nodes back to your disk so that you can download it and put in your local workstation. Ideally, in a simple scenario, you would have a Python script that works also with many other programming languages, a script that submits the job that communicates with the computer nodes. And in this case, we have some requirements for the Python script. This is what a simple Python script looks like. You don't have to understand this. This is just for simplicity. We'll see easier examples on how to do this later on. I have my function. I say I want to run it on 10 cores on my machine, and I can run it by scheduling a communication with the computer nodes that looks pretty much like this, where I specify I work for this person that granted access to this server, so this cluster. I require a certain number of tasks. I want you to perform this thing twice. And I can need more than 3 gigabytes of RAM, and overall it will take me pretty much 10 minutes to run this whole thing. I have my script, I can run it. One of the issues with these things that I faced so far is the amount of time. It becomes a bit difficult to estimate exactly how long certain things are going to take. And so it's very important to have small test units that you can deploy, you can gather results, and then you can do the math and sort of trying to scale it up to see how long this would potentially take in space with memory and in time. With some research examples, now we can give you a bit of overview of what we did, and we'll take a short break after this.
So in this example, I use forest types of Malaysia, and my research objective is identifying suitable climate conditions for forest ecosystem under climate change. So originally I have this a map of the different forest types classification, and then I link the coordinates of each pixel from this map with a 30-year average of climate conditions. And then I applied supervised learning to learn the relations between the climate and the classes of the forest types. And then I use future 30-year average climate generated by other scientists and put it in the random forest model. And then I can predict where in the future will there have suitable climate conditions for each forest type. So on the left route, it is SSP245, which stands for Shared Social Economic Pathways. And on the right is SSP585. So on the left, there's less emission and the future is brighter. On the right, the climate change is worse and the future is less bright. And I projected the suitable conditions for 5 forest types. And we can see at the end by 2071 to 2100, a lot of area turns blue, which means there will have climate conditions more suitable for the blue forest types compared to other forest types. And this blue forest types is at the lower elevation area.
Instead, for my research, I used unsupervised learning, and we were trying to find some structural changes in the forest as a consequence of disturbances. We used a combination of data that we'll also use in the tutorials, raster data and LiDAR data. We applied some PCA for removal of this multidimensional noise, like I mentioned earlier, and in a combination of supervised clustering approaches. So when you pick one, you don't necessarily need to stick to that one. You can combine them in case you have lots of data to process and then fine tune it to a smaller number of clusters, for example. So these examples here are all based on a similar workflow that kind of links a bit with what we talked about in the previous workshop with Sarah and Brianna. The idea of preparing your data, make sure that you have a question ready, and then prepare your data, trying to remove this noise, trying to adapt it to what the algorithm ultimately would need. Do I need a supervised approach or unsupervised approach? Do I have labels that I can rely on that are good labels? Or do I need to explore patterns of the data because I don't have the luxury of these labels? Once my analysis is completed, the ability of storing your data, storing your code on open source, open platforms like Jing.
Yeah. Sorry, was my code?
Ready?
Okay. Okay. So let me go back to the GitHub repository. So in the E&M folder, there are 2 scripts here. One is data preparation, the other is analysis. So you can run them. I will show the logic of them here, but I won't run this right now. So in the data preparation, we have a data set of tree species presence and absence. If we plot them on the map, it's like this on the right. So the green dots show the presence of a tree species called mason pine. It's the original in southern China. And the purple dots are pseudo absence I generated. The number of absence points is the same as the presence points, but you can tune this if you want. So if we look at the data set, it looks like this. So we have this species column, which where 1 means the dot, it shows presence, and 0 means it shows absence. We have coordinates of it, and this is just labels saying it's whether it's presence or absence. And then we can get climate data associated with the coordinates of these points. I have notes here on how to get climate data from a software called Climate AP. It's developed by my supervisor, Tony Wang. There are other climate data sources. You can also change this. And then I converted the climate data from tabular to raster files and saved them locally. So after this, the data preparation is done. In the niche modeling analysis script, first we will import the occurrence and climate data, which is this data set. So if we open it, it has the species occurrence, coordinates, and the associated climate variables here. And before we officially train the supervised machine learning model, which is the random forest model, I used the random forest model to pre-train. In this process, I first just trained this random forest model and select the top 30 important climate variables from all the 76 climate variables. And my official training of the model will only use these top 30 important climate variables. And then there is the training and cross-validation of the random forest model. And after we train the model, we have model evaluation. In the evaluation, we have overall accuracy and some other metrics, such as sensitivity, which I think is the true positive divided by the total number of positives, and other metrics. And after it's evaluated, we have spatial projection and plotting of the future maps. So I have the maps generated here. So in this map, the dark color represents an area having climate conditions that are not very suitable for this tree species, and lighter color means it's more suitable. And I have two. Oh, let me share this to the Zoom. I have two future periods. One is near future, which is, well, near future compared to the original period, which is from 2011 to 2020. And in this plot, we can see there are some changes in the suitable and not suitable areas. Then I generated another plot for the further future period, where we can see a larger area having climate conditions not suitable for the tree species. Yeah, and these are the logics of my example niche modeling tutorial. You can run, so I generated all the data necessary for the training. So if you don't have time, you can directly run the analysis script. And I annotated each steps and have the printing of the progress. Thanks to Copilot, these are easy to generate. So you will know what process it is when it's doing its job. Yeah.
Okay, well then I guess we can take a bit more time to go through the Python applications. So with the R code, you can go through the code at your own pace. I think the key message was you can apply these processes in possibly in a clear way, so then you can reproduce your work in the future, trying to comment your code through the steps. If you need to share the script with others, so then they can read and follow your steps along. And then platforms like GitHub are great places, or Hugging Face are great places to store code and models and weights of your models. And if you have data that can't really fit within GitHub, for example, there are other platforms that you can work with. So similarly for Python, we'll try to go through some of the steps in an orderly fashion, and we'll see what are some of the choices that we made. But before that, I want to briefly talk about some of the packages that are very important for Python users, so they can help you boost your skills and where you can learn from, where they have very enhanced documentation on the things that they do and their API. Just share the screen here real quick.
Let's share this.
So some of you might already be familiar with these, but the packages that we'll deal with for this workshop will be NumPy, scikit-learn for machine learning, NumPy for algebraic operations on matrices and multidimensional arrays, Dask for scaling up of your Python code, scikit-learn for machine learning models and applications, Xarray for scalable arrays. So it's an extension of, like, you can think of it as an extension of NumPy. We have packages to deal with data frames, such as pandas and polars, and a series of other packages that help you do more in-depth codes, in-depth analysis, or parallelize your work. PyTorch and TensorFlow will be exposed a little bit better in the next workshop. So they'll mostly deal with the deep learning approaches and how to take advantage of GPUs at a local scale and at the cluster scale. So for scikit-learn, we have a bunch of options that we can use. These approaches work at local machine scale. So if you try to use scikit-learn on the cluster and try to take advantage of multiple nodes, multiple machines, that is not going to work, because scikit-learn is developed to work at the local level with a single computer. But you can accomplish a variety of tasks, going from regressions to more traditional approaches to clustering, unsupervised learning, classification, such as supervised learning like random forest. You can do dimensionality reduction and data preparation. The API, so the way that you interface with the library, is very, very easy. There's ample documentation on the website on how you can interact with the resources, how are the best choices to, there's a very expanded user guide to understand what these models are doing and how they're behaving. Another very popular one that came out relatively recently is Polars. Polars built on the legacy of Pandas. Pandas is a legacy package that has dealt and still dealing with data frame structures, so tabular fashions, data stored in a tabular fashion, but it really boosts its performance by allowing you to do blazingly fast manipulation of your data, aggregations. This can be done at a single machine level, and they're also launching the Polars Cloud for scalability of your data frame work, pretty much. We'll use later on, and this is designed to easily parallelize your code and scale it up to clusters like the HPC that I mentioned earlier. It's very good at dealing with big data frames and big arrays, so things that generally don't fit within your computer specs. It can easily parallelize your work, so instead of running one thing after the other, you can run multiple things in parallel at the same time or in a concurrently fashion. And it has some direct replacement for the scikit-learn library to apply machine learning algorithms at the cluster level. So it's an easier implementation of some of these approaches. One example above all is if you're doing k-means. K-means, we saw earlier, unsupervised learning approach to partition your data into clusters. You can do it at the local machine level with libraries like scikit-learn, or you can do it at scale with the Dask that offers the exact same interface to deal with these algorithms. So with a relatively low memory footprint, by taking advantage of a large number of CPUs, if that's the case. These are other alternatives that we're seeing with R instead for preparation and plotting. Some of these Jing used in her research as well. We have XGBoost that she talked a lot about earlier, random forest. So these are all implementations that you can also explore. I am not aware, I'm more of a Python user than an R user, so I'm not familiar with libraries that can help you scale up your work. I know that Polars has R implementation as well, which might help you do your data framework at a larger scale, but I'm not familiar with other libraries. So I think that's a bit of introduction. I think we can jump right into the Python tutorial, and we'll try to go step by step through what has been done in there and how you can replicate the work, how you can interface with some of these unsupervised learning approaches, and later on how you can work with HPC or computer clusters. So I think I could connect my computer now here because I have some stuff downloaded. So quickly switch. And we should be able. Right. So if I go back here, where did I put it? I have an HTML folder in the Python directory, and that gives you the rendered documents for easier readability. Here, the code doesn't seem to display very well. It displays a little bit better on your local screen. I think we should start by talking a little bit about dimensionality reduction. By now you're a bit familiar with what it is and one of the benefits of doing this. So you can accomplish this easily using scikit-learn. It's a very easy interface to work with. It's very easy API to work with. And we can do operations on the famous iris dataset that we saw earlier. So in this case, you can follow along the code. I'll try to move a bit quickly. So you don't need to understand every single step that we're taking, but pretty much the general flow of what we're doing is the idea of loading your dataset in, and because iris data is a tabular dataset, we can import that. You can deal with it through pollers. Pollers again allows you for very fast operations on these datasets. You can apply aggregations by group. You can apply statistics to your data and visualization tools embedded with it as well. So again, if we have this iris dataset, it's composed of 4 features and a target attribute where we have species and a bunch of information associated with it. The problem that I mentioned earlier is that we have 4 dimensions in the dataset, but it becomes a bit complicated to understand exactly what's going on if you want to visualize these outputs or if you want to apply some statistics to it. One approach that you can do is, for example, you can group by some of the species and see what are some of the characteristics associated to each species. So in this case, we're looking at mean values, maximum and minimum values for some of these attributes. And so we can very easily very easily summarize these attributes and plot them so that we have information at the group level of what is going on. This helps you understand your data better and understand what is going on with data, especially if you're applying some unsupervised approaches where you don't know what the output would be or what these patterns are within the data. So trying to do a step where you explore some of the attributes, some of the statistics of your data is very important. And then trying to plot the data, see exactly what it looks like, because some of the data that you're dealing with has some spatial attributes, so it's very easy to understand what is going on by plotting it. However, I mentioned earlier that we have 4 dimensions. It becomes a bit difficult to observe these values. So something like a principal component analysis will be the easiest choice to reduce this abundance of dimensions to something that you can more easily visualize. So this can be done again through scikit-learn. We have a bunch of code here. It's mostly for plotting. Allows you to reduce these number of dimensions and come up with something a bit more meaningful. So this is exactly what we saw earlier on in the slides. We have 3 big groups. These are the species, the information that we got directly from our original data set, and we see how these species are distributed, or these observations are distributed within a 3-dimensional space. So from 4 dimensions, we move back to 3 dimensions. So we see that there's no particular sources of noise. It's a pretty easy data set to work with. So we can go ahead and extract some of these statistics, for example, associated with these PCA components, with this reduced dimensions after we apply a PCA transformation. We can, for example, look at what are the most important features that describe our data set. And we see it's the length of the petals, the length of the sepals, and the width of the petals. So we have 3 of these 4 features that are very important that we can keep, and we can remove those that are redundant or they don't give us any meaningful additional information. So this is a first step, again, to reduce the noise in your data, to understand what is going on, see if there are relationships that are visible, for example, within your data set. And again, this can be accomplished easily through a combination of scikit-learn and pollers or pandas. So now that we have our data set, see, it looks pretty good. let's go ahead and do some clustering. We talked earlier about k-means. K-means is this idea of partitioning data into groups and subgroups. And the issue, in a way, with these algorithms is that most of them require you to give them the exact number of clusters, the exact number of groups that you're looking for. So in this case, you have to specify that I'm looking for 3 specific clusters because I know that there are 3 species in this data set. And so that raises the question, what is the right number of clusters? We picked 3 in this case because we already knew that there were 3 species within it. But then something that we'll see later on, like silhouette scores or elbow methods that are very common, allows you to fine-tune the selection of the clusters and see what fits better for what specific question and your data. One other thing that's important that you need to consider when you do clustering is this idea of scaling your data. Sometimes you have a data set that has many features, and these features might have different units. You're working with a point that has a height, has a volume, that has a price, and so forth. And so some of these features might have very different ranges of values. And so by having these differences within your features, it can also drive to a certain direction your clustering. By standardizing these features, so for example, centering their mean in scale or overall scaling these features allows you to compensate a little bit for these variabilities in your data sets, changes in their range, and ultimately, but possibly will give you more truthful outcomes, more truthful clusters. So there are a bunch of options that you can pick from in this pre-processing module that scikit-learn has available. So we first standardize our data. So for every single feature, we scale our data, and then we apply k-means on those results. And then ultimately, it will look a little bit something like this. We still have the 3 clusters that we defined at the beginning, but you might notice that these clusters don't really match exactly what was going on at the very beginning. If you take a look at the corner up here, you see that some of the points overflew into the other clusters. So if I go back up, and then we look at these ones, some of the points belonging to this species were further closer to the yellow ones. But then once we actually applied k-means, we saw that the decision boundary was slightly different. So the algorithm did well, but didn't do perfectly, as we would expect. So we can't really do much because here we already know what the 3 output features would be, but these are things that you wouldn't consider when you don't have any label associated with your data. So overall, it's well structured, but because we have a bit of priori knowledge of what is going on. Otherwise, we will need something again like an elbow method, silhouette scores or similar, tell us some statistics, some information about these clusters. Another one that we can look at, I don't know why, unfortunately, there was an image here. I don't know why they don't display, but that's not a big deal. The other idea is the hierarchical clustering, where we start with every single observation is a cluster per se. And then we start merging them together until we end up with a linkage tree. We start with a new type of data. In this case, we're working with raster data. Raster data, you can think of it as a grid of cells, each representing a specific value. We can have a single band raster, a single image, or we can have, like in this case, a multi-band raster, where every single pixel represents a multitude of information. So in particular here, we're working with Landsat imagery that was collected with 6 bands, each representing a specific wavelength. Over time, this is a relatively dense image, and then we'll see how to sort of deal with it later. The main thing that we could do, for example, is if you actually want to work with something like this, it would be relatively heavy for your machine. Loading this data set and processing this data set would take pretty much 60 gigabytes of space, which is pretty heavy. So in this example, we're simply reducing the amount of the information. We'll subsample our data to a lower resolution to help us go through the workshop and do your computation a bit easier. The importance for the hierarchical clustering, we have a couple of options. So first one is we rely directly on the scikit-learn API. So it's again a very simple API where you input the number of clusters that you need, And then ultimately you end up with something that looks a bit like the K-mean clusters. However, if you want to have a more fine-tuned approach to this type of clustering, then you might want to rely on different libraries. A very popular one is SciPy. SciPy allow you to get a more fine-tuned look at what the decisions of this clustering method, what decisions were taken. So we start by building a linkage tree. So we tell the algorithm, okay, look at every single observation. Every single one of these represents a cluster per se, and then start merging them together. And then eventually we say, okay, what if we decided to cut our histogram, our linkage tree to a certain height? How many clusters will we end up having? So here, once we build this linkage tree, how far these observations are from one another, we said, okay, well, I think a distant threshold of 30 is a pretty reasonable number, and we will end up with 5 clusters. The problem here is what does actually 30 here represent? By having a very complex data set, it's difficult to interpret exactly what these measures are. But more importantly than the measures is what would be the ultimate numbers of clusters that you would have. So by picking different values, you would end up with very different clusters. So depending on where you prune your tree, then your ultimate output, your ultimate classification, your ultimate cluster result will be quite different. So one approach that we can use is, if I can skip here more briefly, is again through silhouette scoring. Here we said, okay, let's pretend that we only need 3 clusters. What would my output look like? We said that with the silhouette scores around 1 looks fantastic. A bunch of observations around 0 is okay. A bunch of observations next to -1 is that you're fully classified. So by picking 3 clusters in my image, I can say, okay, this is relatively decent. We have an average silhouette score of 0.5. We can do better. We iteratively look at what the silhouette score would be if we had picked a different number of clusters. This is what we did at the very beginning here. We computed a different silhouette score for a different number of clusters. And as you can see, as the number of clusters increases, in this case, we went from 3 clusters to 14 clusters, my silhouette score dramatically increases. So again, is this meaningful that we only have 3 clusters in the image? Do we need more clusters? So we have from a statistical point of view, we do know that probably with 3 clusters, we have a better result from a statistical perspective. But does it actually mean that 3 is the best number of clusters for our raster? So again, with silhouette scores or elbow methods, these are things that you can look at. But say that now we take a more reasonable number of clusters, and this is something that we would end up with. We have labels associated with each pixel. So if you take a look at what the actual bands were and what the ultimate label that it would look like, we have some similarities here. If you see these darker areas, we're pretty much labeled in yellow, and we have a bit of noise scattered throughout the image. This here we went with 5 clusters, but again, according to some of the other methods, 3 probably would have been the best number. And then we'll see other examples in a moment that used a lower number of clusters. I mentioned earlier that a very popular algorithm is a density-based algorithm called the DB-scan, or its hierarchical form HDB-scan. This is a density-based spatial clustering of application with noise. So it's a very long name, but it is better suited to deal with data that is a high dimension, that is rich in noise. So one thing that we can think of, well, this pretty much applies well to our initial observation. I would expect a satellite data to have a certain deal of noise in the acquisition. So maybe this is a good choice to test and see if we actually end up with a better number of clusters or a better output image. Again, this can be easily done either through the secular interface or some ad hoc packages. The issue in a way with the DBH scan is it allows you for less control over the ultimate number of output clusters. Instead, it requires a higher level of parameter tuning. So it needs a bit more fine control on the parameters that you pick to obtain a final result. So in this case, we worked with the default parameters, and this is what we would end up with. This is what if our image actually had a total of 3 clusters. It does resemble, for sure, the landscape band, but we can only distinguish between land and water. And then we had a little bit of noise that the algorithm picks up. The issue with that is because we might expect a better performance of the algorithm because it's better tuned for certain application. This comes at a cost where I have to spend more time making sure that the algorithm is fit for the data. So it requires more tuning of the internal parameters of the algorithm in order to possibly give me a more realistic result. And then again, this is important when you think of your research question. What do I need here? How many clusters am I expecting to find? Is there going to be a lot of noise? So these are some of the considerations that you need to make when you pick the specific algorithm. Those different algorithms will require different expertise in terms of how you prepare them for the data, how you apply them to the data. So make sure that you can also trial and error. This is pretty much what you can also do. If you don't think K-mean could work, try it. And hierarchical clustering might or may not work, try it and see what it looks like. See if those results are reasonable. And then, of course, trying to always corroborate with some ground truth if that's available. So we've seen a couple of data types in here, a data set and a raster data. Another very cool feature that we can deal with are LiDAR data. LiDAR data is this revolutionary technology being able to extract the 3-dimensional information about the environment. So this adds an additional level of complexity where we started with a simple iris data set. It's a tabular fashion where we have observation and features. We moved to a raster data set where we incorporate the spatial information on a flight grid, so X and Y, north and easting. And then we moved all the way to LiDAR where we have to integrate 3-dimensional components. So not only are we aware about the Y and X features, but also about the depth of the observations. So for example, if you're looking at tree height, we have points. If we scan a forest, the forest with LiDAR, we would end up with a cloud of points, each associated with the X, Y, and a Z coordinate. So this adds an additional level of complexity. That's why oftentimes this information is converted into a flat grid where you summarize some properties of the data within a pixel, within a cell, or you can directly manipulate this 3-dimensional data through a different series of approaches. In Python, the simplest alternative to work with LiDAR data is through the LastPy package. Allows you to read it and write outputs. And then it's pretty much up to you on how you want to manipulate this data. So in this case, we loaded a tree, a single tree that we extracted from this 4 species 20K dataset. This is an open access database that is being uploaded on Zenodo. You can download the observations from there. Every single file represents a single labeled tree. And this is very good for certain approaches where you have high quality label data. In our case, we thought, what if we take a tree and then we see if we can segment, if we can clusterize every single branch within that tree? How would that look like? We import our point cloud data. And then we say, I think HDB scan is a good choice. It's a density aware algorithm. I would expect branches to have a certain density of points. There will be a gap and there might be another branch nearby. So let's go ahead. Let's tune some of these parameters of HDB scan and see what our result would look like. And this is something that we end up with. It kind of looks a bit ugly at first, but we have a little tree and we can say for sure it didn't really do a good job and identifying branches within this tree. We also did a very poor job at preparing properly the data and tuning the parameters. This is the first approximation of what it would look like, trials and errors. Maybe it did a good job of segmenting a little bit of the first branch, but in here too, I see a lot of noise. So maybe HDB scan is not the best choice for the job. Maybe other types of algorithms or other models are more suited for the task. So this primarily is the idea of using unsupervised learning and considering choices, considering different options when working with different types of data and trying to answer these types of questions, different types of questions. For other applications related to LiDAR or in-depth observations, so you can also join our next workshop. It's March, spelling there, March the 24th. So this is the idea of unsupervised learning. Again, I think it's now time we can move to the second tutorial that will conclude the second part that's the trying to distribute our code to supercomputers. Unfortunately, here I want to see, yeah. For some reason, the images don't really display well, but that's fine. Can increase this a little bit too. So what we saw with unsupervised learning is cool, but primarily it runs on a single machine. If you have a large amount of data that you need to deal with, maybe high performance computing clusters is the way to go. So we have access to this large array of nodes distributed across the country, and specifically we are working with the close one that we have at SFU, which is named CEDAR. It's important to know that these supercomputers are handled by a specific job scheduler. The job scheduler is the piece of software that is in charge of deploying scripts to the computer nodes. In particular, CEDAR uses this LERM job cluster. So you need to know a little bit how these scheduling software works before you can actually submit tasks to the supercomputer. So briefly in here, we'll look at trying to run some parallel code on a single node and then trying to distribute some of our code on multiple nodes. A single node represents a single computer. Multiple node represents an assemblage of computers where, for example, we require more resources than what a single computer can give us. So it's very important to this distinction because some code is exclusively designed to run within a local node, within a single node. So if you're trying to use regular libraries to parallelize your code, that might not be effective if your code requires multiple resources. So if your code runs on multiple nodes, using basic packages like multiprocessing or joblib, unfortunately won't cut it. You need specific tools that allow this communication across nodes. And one great tool that you can work with is Dask. Dask is a Python package and it helps you scale your work to a supercomputer, whether that's a single node or a multi-node. Dask has designed a sort of sub-package called Dask Job Queue that allows you to communicate directly with different job schedulers. So in this case, CEDAR is managed by the SLORM job scheduler. And so Dask Job Queue allows you to interact with this scheduler to deploy your work to a multitude of nodes. So the API of Dask is very, very vast. There are many options that you can use to parallelize your code on the single node or on a supercomputer. And you gotta take a little bit of time to familiarize with it. But overall, it's a relatively simple API in the sense that it's very well documented. There are a bunch of examples, on how to use it and deploy your code. One important thing is that if you don't require Dask necessarily, it's better not to use it. These libraries are heavy and are well suited for specific jobs. So if you need something that doesn't apply to the design of this app, maybe it's not the best choice for the job. For example, if I'm running a code and the code perfectly runs on my local computer, there's no need to use Dask because Dask might slow your computer down because of the overhead of the package itself. So instead, it's a great choice if you need to deploy your code on multiple nodes because it allows for a very, very simple interface. Dask has a series of modules called array and data frame. It allows you to work with the big arrays, big data frames that don't fit within your computer. So in this case, we call Dask array to build an array that has 2.5 billion cells, so which might not fit within your computer. And then we want to apply simple computation to this data set. We want to see what the value would be if I added one, if I added a unit. We create originally this data set, and then we start the communication with the cluster. To do that, you need to be in that login mode that we talked earlier. So once you are granted access to the server, to the cluster, then you can build your script and then you can deploy the script from within yes.
Okay, but did you also need to build your data within the computer?
Not necessarily. So some of these are connected to the internet. So you can easily download the data from the internet, or you can transfer data, these clusters, For example, through Globus. Globus allows for easy transfer between your local node, your local machine computer, to the larger supercomputer. So that can be easily done. In other cases, clusters are not connected to the internet. So I don't know exactly what the procedure would be in those cases. But Cedar, for example, is connected to the internet, so you can download data. You can download your repository, so you can have code developed in your local machine and simply run it on the supercomputer. So in this case, we build the array within the computer, the supercomputer. We apply our function, and this function requires two inputs. The first is this slurm cluster function, which tells Dusk how to talk to the supercomputer. And then we open a client. A client is our interface to communicate with the cluster. And then within this client, then we can say, okay, I require you to deploy this function using one single node or using a multitude of nodes. So in this case, we are calling a single worker. We scale our cluster to a single worker. And then for every single piece of our array, we deploy our function. And then Dusk has has a lazy function, meaning that Dusk applies a function, but it doesn't really until you actually ask it to do it. So it prepares the function to be run on your data, but it waits for your input to ultimately run it. So in this case, we have prepared the function, we map it, so we apply to the pieces of our data set, and then we explicitly ask to compute it. And that computation will pretty much occur within the supercomputer. And from there, you can download the data back to your local disk and to your local machine. Unfortunately, I can't really run the slide because there are some queuing issues where it might take a little bit of time for your work to actually be deployed. But as you might observe, this is a relatively simple syntax that you can work with compared to the old-fashioned way where you need to build a script, to build a submission script that we saw earlier. This is easier because it doesn't require you to deploy your job manually with a separate script, but rather you let Dusk deal with all the internals of the communication. You simply define who you are, how many resources you want, and then you deploy your code to the supercomputer for it to be computed. So this is the simple example on how you can deploy it on either a single or a multi-node. There's no difference for Dusk. It only depends on the number of resources that you use. But there are limitations on the supercomputer side. So some of these computers only have a certain number of resources per node. So you need to be aware of what the specs of these computers are before you submit a task. For example, say that I'm communicating with Cedar. Cedar, every single node of Cedar has anything between 32 to 48 cores. So it's not a good choice to say that I want 60 cores for every single node because your task will be split. It will be more difficult for the scheduler to find the resources needed because you need a node and a little bit more. So perhaps the best choice is you fill up a single node and you require multiple of those so that your job can be dispatched on multiple nodes and perhaps your computation may run faster. So that makes it all easier for Dusk because the interface is relatively simple to work with. So this is the idea of using single and multiple nodes, and then I'll quickly conclude with the idea of parallelizing your code, whether this is within your local computer or within the cluster. So Dusk also offers a great interface to delay your functions until computation is actually needed. So I mentioned earlier, you apply a function to every single component of your array, but then you don't actually apply the function until you request it. So the Dusk is ready to run it, but then the moment that you call the compute function to it, that's when it runs. The importance of having a delay in your function is that Dusk can make some optimizations on how to run that function and that can more easily parallelize that function based on your computer resources or on your cluster resources. So this is again a very simple interface because you are able to write your functions, apply a decorator. That's what we're doing here. You tell the Dusk, you tell this function that this function will be delayed until I require it. And then later on, you can call this function with a specific number of workers. Say that I want to use 8 cores of my CPU to run this function in parallel. When Dask is going to do that for you, that's pretty much what is going on in the background. The issue is it actually useful to do that? If you look at these two functions, they are exactly the same. One is delayed, one is not. We ran a very simple speed test. We see that pretty much they ran at the same amount of time. There was no difference of running the first one delayed with 8 workers versus using the second one that ran sequentially. This is because Dask is not really magic. Dask can parallelize your function calls, but can make the function parallel, which is slightly different. So in this case, Dask is trying to run this function multiple times on 8 cores, but the internals of the functions still run sequentially. So there's ultimately no benefit, and perhaps there's even a slower runtime for the delayed function because of the extra overhead of preparing the function. So in this case, there's no need to use Dask unless it's absolutely necessary, unless you can't load your data in memory, unless you need to scale your data to a larger cluster. So this is some considerations that you need to take into account. And ultimately, there's a little parenthesis on the machine learning modules of Dask and the GPU nodes, where Dask has put more and more effort into developing machine learning models that can be more easily scaled to the cluster. So we saw k-means earlier. With scikit-learn, we can apply it only to our local machine or a single node. But if we have a very large amount of data and we require more computational power, well, Dask allows us for a very easy integration of some algorithms to be run on a larger number of machines. So for now, the code base of Dask ML, the machine learning module of Dask, is relatively small, so there aren't many algorithms available yet. But the more time passes, the more they're gonna enrich it. So for now, it's limited to some basic ones, but allows you for scalability. And then ultimately, Dask has has a small interface with the GPU nodes where you can take advantage of GPUs for your computation. But this is pretty much a topic for the next workshop where we'll use different packages. So that's the end of the tutorial, and that's pretty much covers the tutorials that we had in the second hour of the workshop. But if you want to run this code, the unsupervised clustering is very easy. You can run it on your local machine. For this part of the code, you can also run it on your local machine. If you have access to the supercomputer, you can run it. It's runnable, but it might take a little bit of time to go through it too. Otherwise, it's primarily for reference. If you're more interested, I think you can look at some Dask user guides that have a bit more detailed information. But for the time being, that's just a template, like a blueprint. So that concludes what we have for now. If there are any specific questions, maybe less on the coding, more on the concepts. Otherwise, we can quickly wrap it up. Unless anyone has something. Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to focus on the coding rather than the concepts. We take a step back and talk about the last pi package. So said like benchmarking. Have you done any benchmarking with that versus some of the like the R packages like LiDAR and laser?
I haven't done benchmarking on that side. The thing that I would think of is that those packages are designed for slightly different things. LastPy is more designed to read the data in and write it out, less on the manipulation side. LiDAR and the laser, which are two great alternatives for the R side to manipulate LiDAR data, are more designed for collections of LiDAR data or for faster manipulation. Focused also on the reading and writing for sure, but it's different concepts, I think. LastPy more on reading in and out, and the R versions more on the manipulation side. Okay. And any final thoughts, questions, sir? No, awesome. Well, then thanks for coming. Thanks for the attention. Sorry if we went a little bit over time. You appreciate it. Thank you. And welcome to join us in our next workshop, the end of next month.
Thanks, John. Good job, you too. That was really good.